So that's why, to close where I started with New Zealand, I mean, it's wonderful to be here. Not only, I mean, I took my first steps here, not my first steps in politics, but literally my first steps in my Auntie Betty's garden, where I was earlier today. And it's wonderful to see my family here. It's wonderful to see all of you here. But the real pleasure for me in being in this country is I think this is the sort of natural state that my country would be in if it were not subjected to the bureaucracy. If it were in charge of its own territory and its own resources. If it weren't, at a time like this, with national debt rising by £5,000 a second, if it were not still finding £12 billion a year to hand to the Brussels budget. And above all, if it were a functioning parliamentary system in which supreme power was wielded by elected officials whom the rest of us can hire and fire. It's natural, my friends, to take these things for granted. We all take for granted what we've grown up with, but please be conscious of how lucky you are in a world where these things are not always common, to have in your hands the ability to put things right. I look forward to the day when the United Kingdom takes back the things that New Zealand takes for granted and becomes, once again, a sovereign democracy, generous, prosperous, and free. So with your permission, Catherine, I'll just take questions until... It's a very good question. What he means is the harmonization of employment law and social policy and tax. Now, who thinks that the harmonization of tax will be in a downward direction? Right? And again, there is a reason, there is a structural, logical reason for this. Right? When you have competing states, then there is a constraint, there is an external constraint on the spending of the government. You can raise your taxes up to a certain level, and then people start going abroad, and revenue starts going abroad, and you become bankrupt, and so you have to lower them again. That doesn't happen if you have, as in the European Union, mechanisms which allow you to harmonize tax. You've then got, instead of the tough process of having to persuade your electorate to reduce their spending, you've got the much easier option of exporting your costs to somebody else. So you take away, or at least you reduce, the option of money going abroad. It's the same thing with social policy, employment law. You can give your workforce incredibly generous entitlements on paternity leave and holidays and so on, up to a certain level. Then the factories start going abroad and closing, and the jobs migrate. But of course, rather if you're, the president of France and you've got a big system of what they call les droits acquis, of these acquired social rights, rather than taking that on, much easier to say everyone else should have the same expensive setup that we have. And then there's nowhere else for the capital to go. Because the flaw in that argument is that there is always somewhere else for it to go. It may just about have worked in the 1950s when the European Union was set up, when geographical proximity mattered. These days it is an impossible argument, with 199 states and territories in the world, with capital flowing around at the touch of a button. The only way to be competitive is to be diffuse, diverse, decentralized. The tragedy of Europe is that just at the moment when the rising powers of Asia have grasped this, when they have gone from being the great centralized administrative blocks that they were and have gone down the road towards decentralizing decision-making, we are doing the opposite. You don't find mandarins in China anymore, but you find lots of them in Brussels. We are going down the Ming, Mughal, Ottoman road towards uniformity, high taxes, bureaucracy, all the rest of it, at the very moment when the rest of the world has discovered the secret of Europe's historical success, namely that it was never a unified state, but rather a competing state system. So it's tragic that Mr. Van Rompuy is, in the name of Europe, doing the most anti-European thing possible and turning his back on that great European heritage of diversity and variety and pluralism. If you sit back and say it's all going to collapse, I mean, all right, yeah, it will collapse one day. It's what we used to say about the communist system. It won't work, and we were right, it didn't work, right? But it wouldn't have been much fun to have been born, in St. Petersburg, Kirka, 1910, and lived through the process of it not working, right? There are always things you can do to try and hasten the corrective. there is a real problem in Greece. Greece has they just got a new government. And the new government got in and said, we've looked at the books, and it turns out we've got an even bigger deficit than Britain. It's running at 12% of GDP, whereas they previously said it was at 5%. It is going to be a test. Are German and British taxpayers, who are historically the ones who pay everything into the pot, going to be prepared to bail out a country in order to rescue it from the consequences of its own profligacy? I don't know. But all I would say is don't expect that the thing is just going to collapse in our lifetime. I mean, yes, it may do. To go back to the Comic-Con parallel, we may be in 1989 with these no votes in the referendums having been the great popular uprising against a remote and unelected bureaucracy. Or we may be in 1956 where the protests have only just started and where we've got another half century to live through. But what I do know is that you can't swim forever against the current of public opinion. The system has no legitimacy. We used to think that it was just a British problem, right? You say, oh, Britain's an island and you've got all these links to all these other English-speaking countries, you're not properly European. You know what? It turns out that everyone else felt the same way. As soon as they were allowed to vote, the Dutch and the French and so on expressed equal contempt and hostility for the system. So we have this bizarre situation where public opinion in almost every member state is against the current European Union, let alone the further centralization of power. And yet where there is no mechanism to translate that into public policy, that cannot be sustainable. Eventually, somebody will turn and swim with the current. And my fervent hope is that it will be my party in the United Kingdom. We had this extraordinary situation in Britain where all three parties promised a referendum on this constitution. And all three have now reneged. Now that simply cannot be healthy in any democratic system. So, I'm an optimist about these things. I live in hope for the day when people will finally come to their senses and say we're a free country, we're a sovereign democracy, we're an independent people, and we're capable of thriving, running our own affairs in our own interests, just like New Zealand. If they can do it with 3 million people, I think we might just manage with 60 million. Yeah.
It's been pleasing recently to say David Cameron and the Conservative Party picking up some of your plan. But tying in nicely with the previous question, if you were in David Cameron's position, like you're about to win an election, given the Lisbon Treaty is now in force, what do you actually do?
I think the issue is now whether we are part of the European Union. You're right, we can't stop all the other countries pushing ahead with the Lisbon Treaty if that's what they want to do. But we can decide whether we want to be part of it. And that is a decision that we should make through our own national democratic mechanisms and procedures. The only reason not to have had a referendum, and to repeat, all three parties promised a referendum. In fact, all the parties promised a referendum. The Green Party, the Scottish National Party, the independent doctor who represents Kidderminster, everyone had promised a referendum. We have 646 members of Parliament at Westminster, of whom 638 were returned on the basis of a manifesto pledge that there would be a referendum, right? So it is, I can't begin to tell you how outrageous it is that there should not have been one. If the Lisbon Treaty is now in force, that doesn't undo the argument for having a referendum on whether Britain should participate in it and whether we should be part of this process of ever closer integration, or whether we should say to our friends and our allies on the continent, fine, if you guys want to do this, do it without us. We can see where you want to go. It's all written there clearly in the Constitution. It's with the President and the European Police Force and the European Army. Do it. Do it with our blessing. Do it with our goodwill. We'll be cheering you on from outside. We'll be supporting you externally, like a flying buttress on a cathedral. Right? You can always rely on our open markets, on our military alliance, on our diplomatic support, but we will not bargain with our democracy. We will not compromise our independence. I have to say, doing that would also allow us to rejoin the wider community of older friends that we have. Our policy has been so skewed towards the immediate horizons of a rather outdated geographical bloc. To repeat, it may have made sense 40 years ago in a pre-internet age. It may have made sense to invest a lot of energy in your immediate geographical neighbours. But those arguments have simply been overtaken by technology.